name is Damien Hannigan. I'm Public Relations Officer with the Irish Deer Commission. On behalf of our officers, executive and members, I'd like to welcome you to our virtual Deer Rut event. As many of you will know, in recent years we typically hold an annual Rut Watch event in Killarney National Park, and unfortunately due to the current COVID-19 guidelines we're unable to hold this event like many other people this year. So we've had a number of variations of this event. Our plan was to hold the event first of all. Secondly, then we had planned to hold the event with a number of speakers, but unfortunately in recent days, as we know, there's been additional guidelines. So unfortunately it's myself who's speaking to you today, or fortunately, whichever way you want to look at it. So what I'm going to do today is just give you a little bit of background to the rut. We asked you for some questions in regards to deer and the rut, and I'm just going to try and answer just a small number of those questions. We received a lot, so I won't get through them all. And after that, then we're going to look at some video and images of this year's rut, and then we'll close up matters after that. So I suppose just a small bit of background about red deer in Killarney National Park. I suppose the red deer in Killarney National Park, a lot of people say they're our last native red deer, and what we do know about red deer in Killarney is that they've existed since Neolithic times, and that's over 5,000 years ago. So in 2012, Dr. Ruth Carden, who's our scientific advisor, and other scientists completed a piece of research in terms of looking at the DNA of the deer in Killarney National Park. And we do know that the deer have contained DNA that has existed for over 5,000 years, which is unique in Ireland. So in regards to the deer themselves, I suppose within the red deer family we have numerous subspecies of red deer. So the red deer in Killarney are unique in Ireland and not found anywhere else. I suppose the rut in Killarney, it's kind of happens in two areas. Once we have the lowlands area, and many of the videos and images that we'll see today are from the lowland areas, and these stags tend to be much larger animals, quite large bodied animals. And also then there's a population of deer in the uplands or in the mountains, and these animals can be smaller in size, and this is mainly due to the habitat and the feeding that they have in that area. So there's quite a significant difference. Also this time of the year we see a number of these red deer from the lowlands that will move into the uplands as well. So often we can see animals that would just particularly for the rut, that they'll travel for that time of the year. So the rut itself, what is the rut? I suppose the rut is a time of the year when male deer throughout Ireland are driven by the urge to breed with female deer, and they will go in search of deer to breed with. So here in Killarney, typically what we see is in the lowland animals is that when two large animals of equal size come together, they tend to they'll fight, and the dominant or winning stag will have the opportunity to breed with females. So obviously in Kerry here, where the numbers at the moment are estimated to be in the region of somewhere between 700 and 1,000 deer, there's a lot of females and a lot of stags, so the rut can be quite a frenzied event, and particularly this week when we're in the latter stages of the rut. The rut itself kind of kicks off in kind of end of September, and it tends to finish at the end of October into early November. And really it's the dominant stags in the lowland areas of Killarney. There's maybe 4 or 5 dominant stags, and they tend to breed with the majority of females. What typically happens at the end of the rut is these deer are exhausted. They can lose up to 20% of their body weight because there's such a frenzied activity. They don't really feed a lot, and what happens is some of the lesser stags then get an opportunity to breed with females that haven't come into season. So it's quite a spectacular time of the year. It's really one of the highlights of the wildlife calendar is the deer rut, and Killarney National Park is probably one of the best places in Europe to observe the rut at a safe distance, and that's proven by the number of people that travel from all over the world, all over Ireland, photographers, filmmakers, and indeed at the moment the BBC are actually currently filming a documentary here on the rut in Killarney National Park that will air in the coming years. So it's quite an important place in terms of red deer in Ireland and internationally. and very important from a conservation point of view in regards to the red deer. So just a couple of things on the rut itself. So I just have a number of questions that we received, and thank you for submitting your questions. So the first question is asked here is, why do deer have antlers? A very good question. I suppose deer, it's the male deer in Ireland have antlers, and typically I suppose the reason why deer would have antlers are for two reasons. One is for fighting. So when males fight during the rut, they lock antlers, and it's not particularly the animal with the biggest antlers will win that fight. It's typically the animal with the largest body weight. That's the first thing. It's the fight. It's really to attract females as well. Often you'll see deer that have vegetation attached to their antlers because they've rubbed against vegetation or they're covered in mud, and deer see this as a way of attracting females, believe it or not, during the rut. So they're really the two main reasons why deer have antlers as such. So just a question here then again in terms of what other deer species do we have in Ireland. So what I've done is I've just a couple of examples of the deer that we have. So if I start with the smallest deer that we have, so we have 3 deer species, and this is the Sika deer, and this is a 6-point Sika deer, and they're also found here in Killarney National Park. So Sika deer were introduced to Ireland in 1860 by Lord Powerscourt, and then a number of deer were gifted to County Kerry in 1862, and the Sika deer that we see now in Killarney National Park and indeed throughout County Kerry are origins of those deer that were introduced in 1860. The next deer then that we have in Ireland is the fallow deer, and fallow deer were introduced into County Wicklow by the Normans, and the difference with the fallow deer is they have palmated antlers, where the Sika and the red deer tend to have more points with long beams, so they're palmated antler shape as opposed to what we see in the other species. So that's the fallow deer. At one point the fallow deer was believed to be the most common deer in Ireland. That now would suggest that the Sika deer is the most common deer, and the least frequent deer that we have is the red deer. So the next one we're going to look at is this is a red deer. So this is a 16-point native Irish red deer from Killarney National Park, and unfortunately this animal was fatally wounded during the rut, which is something sadly that we see from time to time, but just one of those parts of nature in regards to it's one of the things that it can happen during the rut, that deer are maybe gored by the antlers of another deer, and particularly these brow tines here, they're used for protecting the face of the deer, but also as well they can cause a lot of injuries, as the antlers can themselves. So this is as I said, a 16-point native Irish red deer. It's just worth pointing out then as well, we also have other forms of red deer in Ireland, and this red deer here, while the antler height may be very similar to the Kerry one, it's substantially heavier. These antlers are really heavy in comparison to the native Irish red deer. So typically the body weight of these animals will be substantially more than the Kerry red deer, and there's a couple of reasons for that. Is that within the red deer family there's different subspecies, so we have different subspecies of deer, and these two deer are different subspecies. So you would have some species that were bred for farming, for venison, and are substantially larger body weights, and some of these have been introduced to Ireland in the last maybe 40-50 years, and this particular deer would have its origins from deer parks in the UK. So very much a different species of red deer, a different type of animal altogether. But just to give you an example of this, and this animal actually has 18 points. And when I mention points, you can obviously see what I'm counting is the points of the antler. That when we say it's an 18-point antler. I suppose an interesting thing about antlers is that each kind of end of March, early April each year, stags and bucks is the terminology we use for a male fallow deer, where Sika and red are called stags. They cast the antlers each year, and they cast them at the base here, which is known as the pinnacle, or pedicle, beg your pardon, and so they're cast each year and they grow new antlers. So typically a young deer is growing small antlers, and as they get older the antlers get larger. And then when deer get really older, it actually tends to reverse. It's what we call going back, it loses its number of points. It may be a large body weight, but it tends to lose the number of points. So that's just a small thing. But antlers, I suppose they are the fastest growing animal tissue in the world. In some of the larger deer species, antlers can grow up to 1 inch per day. And what happens is they tend to, when they're growing, they grow in a kind of a soft velvet surrounded by blood. And typically kind of July, August time, they tend to scrape off that velvet. And when they scrape it off, the antlers are actually white. And then what they do is they colour them to the brown colour that we see by rubbing against vegetation. So it's interesting that if you see deer in an area where there's not vegetation, as we've seen on some of our islands off the coast, the antlers can be very white in comparison to the lowland animals that are colouring antlers against rubbing against trees and so on. So that's just kind of part of the life cycle. As I said, they shed them in March, April time, and they're fully grown typically by July, August, and then they're scraping off the velvet in preparation for the rush that begins at the end of September. So that's just a small bit of information on those. So just back to my questions. So in regards to deer, why do deer need to be culled? And that's a very common question that we would get, I suppose. In previous times where we had predators to manage deer numbers when they were lower in number, deer numbers would have been kept at some form of level, but it also always involved some form of hunting by man in terms of to provide food. So man would have made tools with their antlers or with skins of the deer, or used the meat or the venison from the deer. So it's probably important to say, in the absence of a natural predator, it does fall on man to manage deer numbers at sustainable levels, because where deer numbers become excessive, they can cause a lot of damage to farming, forestry and the wider ecosystem. And indeed, in Killarney National Park, the park itself has suffered levels of damage from the deer, along with other browsing animals such as sheep and goats and so on. So there's a lot of competition for vegetation. So it's really important that we keep deer at sustainable numbers, just to reduce that impact, and that's one of the reasons why we do that. So then just the last question I'm just going to cover off is that it's been asked, in terms of, instead of culling deer, why don't we move deer to other parts of Ireland, as the red deer in Killarney National Park? So again, just coming back to the point that I made earlier in terms about the different subspecies, if we were to move red deer from Killarney National Park, say for example to Galway, in Galway we have non-native red deer, and the native red deer will breed with the non-native red deer, and as such destroying that species of deer. The one thing that we have done as a country is that we have moved deer from Killarney National Park in the 1980s. They were actually flown by helicopter in large cargo cases, is to the island of Inishfickalon, based off the coast of County Kerry, and that was to protect the future conservation status of red deer in County Kerry, that if anything were to happen to them, that we had that safety net to sort of say we have a population in an island setting where there's no other deer present. So that's the only place really we could ever move Kerry red deer, is to an island location. Otherwise, within Ireland, there are other species of deer. There's also a conservation threat to red deer in County Kerry at the moment in two ways. Is that one is the sika deer that we mentioned. In particularly man-made circumstances, red deer and sika deer can interbreed and what they call hybridize, and you end up with a crossbreed between a red deer and a sika deer. And as we've seen in Wicklow now, there's no red deer present in County Wicklow because hybridization has taken place. So that's something that we'll be real concerned, and we know in the West Cork area that this has happened in a man-made situation where their red deer and sika deer have bred, and we have what they call hybrids, and they are actually living in the wild. So that's really an important one that we look to make sure that those deer do not find their way to County Kerry, because if that does happen, effectively deer that have existed for over 5,000 years could effectively be wiped out. So that's really important. Also on the Limerick border, we also have some populations of non-native red deer, and similarly as with the hybrids, if they were to get to County Kerry, that would endanger the future status of red deer in County Kerry. So that's really important to note. I suppose in terms of, as I said earlier on, red deer, the number, depending what you look at, the number of somewhere between 700 and 1,000. But believe it or not, in the 1960s into the 70s, the numbers had reduced as low as 60 animals, and there was a real danger to their future conservation status. There was a point in time where they were not tolerated in the lowlands by the lords or the owners of the estate, and they were very much banished to the mountains. But in the 60s and 70s, overhunting, poor conservation and management meant that the numbers were virtually wiped out. And thankfully now, red deer in County Kerry are fully protected, and they can't be hunted. Any culling takes place by the National Parks and Wildlife Rangers. So just a small bit about them. So look, there's lots of other questions. We probably won't have time to get through to them. We might try and cover some of them through the video or later on. But for the moment, I'm just going to end my piece, and what we'll do now is just look at some images of video and photographs from this year's rut, and possibly some from last year as well, but the vast majority from this year. And I'd just like to in advance thank all our photographers and filmmakers who donated footage this year, in particular the difficult circumstances, so we were very much limited to Kerry-based photographers, so that was a challenge this year. We'd just like to thank them. So look, enjoy the footage, and I'll touch back with you later on. Thank you. Hi, Damien back here again. I hope you enjoyed our video footage and our images from this year's rut in Killarney National Park. Just going to say some thank yous before we finish up. Is just again, I mentioned earlier on, just to thank our various contributors of video and photographs. Very much appreciated. And in regards to also those who helped in terms of making today's footage happen and take place, so very much appreciate that. I suppose just a couple of things is that the Irish Deer Commission, we're our website is, should I say, is irishdeercommission.ie. We're also on Twitter and on Facebook. So if there's something that we haven't covered today, please visit us on those social media pages, or you can email us at info@irishdeercommission.ie. Also, we're a membership organisation. We offer junior membership for €10. We offer ordinary membership for 20 and family for 25. And you can apply for membership via our website, irishdeercommission.ie, or you can email us at membership@irishdeercommission.ie. We're a voluntary organisation, so we appreciate any support that we can get, and we're very much appreciative of the support that we get from our existing members, our supporters, and the various agencies that we work with throughout the country. Also, like just to mention our charity partners, who is Bumblins. And Bumblins, as many of you know, do valuable and really important work throughout Ireland, in the sense that they provide a fleet of ambulances specifically for children and families in challenging circumstances. So I would encourage you to make a donation today to Bumblins, and if you visit the Bumblins website, bumblins.ie, you'll just clearly see it's quite easy just to make a donation, and any amount of money will be very much appreciated by the charity. Just acknowledge, as I said at the outset, in terms of COVID-19, as a country and as a world, I suppose we're dealing with unprecedented times, and it's very challenging times. But I'd just like to acknowledge the fantastic and amazing work all our frontline workers do for everyone's benefit and putting themselves at risk, and we just really a big thumbs up to them, and a thank you. And I'd encourage everyone just to adhere to the rules and the guidelines, not alone to protect yourself and your families, but to protect others as well, and we'll all eventually get through this together. So look, without further ado, I'm just going to sign off here and thank you all for attending, and hopefully next year we'll be back to our normal Route Watch event. But keep an eye on us, as I said, in terms of on our social media websites. We will be running other events online in the meantime as well. So thank you for attending today, and stay safe, everybody. Take care.